Hello, this is Jay McCluskey, and I'm proud to continue in our series of lessons on Deuteronomy. This is lesson 3, in addition to the introduction lesson that we shared, and looking forward to continuing on in these early chapters of Deuteronomy with you. Back in the 40s and 50s, and even in the early 60s, there were a series of movies from Bing Crosby and Bob Hope and Dorothy Lamour. They're all on the theme of on the road. They're on the road to Singapore, on the road to Hong Kong, on the road to Zanzibar, I believe was in there. This is a story that we're talking now. I could call On the Road to Moab, which is a telling of the Hebrew people when they started to come out of the wilderness journey, and now they're going to Moab, which will be the place by which they will cross over into the promised land. I do hope that you have your outline that you can download from church website, or you can acquire one just by contacting the church office. We'll be happy to give you the entire notebook and have that in front of you as we share together. And I asked the question there at the beginning of that outline of how did we get to where we are? Last week, we looked way back 38 years before as Moses retells to the Hebrew people who were at Moab at that time of an incident that took place with their parents in Kadesh Barnea, where they had the opportunity to follow God's leadership and go and claim the promised land, and they were frightened and fearful and turned on God, thought God had betrayed them, and so they consequently had to wander in the wilderness all that time. And so here we're going to kind of talk to that generation about, okay, now the wilderness time has come over, and you get to come on to the promised land border again, and the journey will continue. So they've been on a little different road. It is set up there in Deuteronomy 2 now, in chapter 2, verse 1. When we turned back and we set toward the wilderness along the road of the Red Sea, the Lord had directed me. For a long time we made our way around the hill country of Seir. And of course that's in the wilderness there. It's in Sinai Peninsula. If you have your map that came in your materials from lesson 1, you know this wandering time in here. No one wanted that land. They weren't competing for it. I'm convinced if God hadn't fed them manna and provided them water and provisions, the Bible even says that their clothes didn't wear out in all those years that they were wandering. If God hadn't taken care of them, they couldn't have survived. But survive they did. And so now it is that's where they have been for 38 years. And now the road that has brought them now northernly, stay on my map here, northernly up on the eastern side of the Dead Sea and up to Moab on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. So we have some lessons, I think, that are worthwhile as we walk through this chapter and a little beyond. And one of the most meaningful to me on all of our journeys is this first lesson. It says, the wait and the wandering will be over. Then the Lord says to me in the next verse, you have made your way around this hill country long enough. Now turn north. As we saw, it had turned north. 38 years of wandering, and now God says that's enough. What he had wanted and needed to accomplish in that faithless generation before to have died out, and now with a new fresh group of Hebrews that they could move forward. And he says 38 years passed from the time we left Kadesh Barnea and we crossed the Zered Valley, and by then the entire generation of fighting men had perished from the camp as the Lord had sworn to them. And we shared last week about how it said the smallest children who didn't know right from wrong, they weren't going to be denied going into the promised land in the future, but those who were the fighting men of that generation. So really in chapter 1, the end, we're talking about Kadesh Barnea and 38 years before, and now suddenly we're fast forward 38 years to what would be this generation. And I find that it is interesting to review the stories that Moses skipped that was in those wandering days. I looked in the book of Numbers and kind of flipped through because that's where that part of the history is told. And just give you a few examples of the stories that were not retold. I mean, this is Deuteronomy is kind of looking back to prepare us to move forward, but he doesn't look back at everything. So he says in Numbers 20, there's water from the rock. He didn't tell that story. We looked at it last week because Moses was saying, it's your people's fault that I don't go in the promised land. We said, well, maybe Moses needs to take some of the blame. And we revisited that story in Numbers 20. Numbers 21, one of my favorite stories, the bronze snake. Poisonous serpents are infiltrating the Hebrew camp. And God gives Moses a directive for healing, to make a bronze stake and put it in the middle of the camp, and people can look at it and find healing. And Jesus in John chapter 3, in his conversation with Nicodemus, says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so also must the Son of Man be lifted up, and for healing for the peoples. And so a very New Testament application of that Old Testament story. Moses doesn't remind them and retell that one. And then Numbers 22, it's just a kind of a novel story about a man named Balaam and his donkey, and the donkey talks to Balaam. The talking donkey story. It is kind of interesting. It's a little long, so it's hard to preach and sometimes even hard to teach, but it's a favorite for occasionally for children's classes to tell that story. Now, you don't get those details. Perhaps it's because this generation that Moses is talking directly to would have experienced those. They would have been born and lived in those wilderness days, and so it doesn't have to retell them something that they would have remembered. They had not experienced Kadesh Barnea, and so he did in detail retell that story, and he moves ahead. I imagine 38 years of waiting is pretty heavy. And to go back to the point that there comes a time when the waiting and wandering is over. Most people have lived on this earth long enough, have had those times of discouragement and disappointment and sorrow and maybe grief and a heaviness of heart and anxiety and depression. And maybe it feels like, in fact, it does feel like that's here to stay. Oh, I'll never feel better. It has got such a grip on your emotions, things. It just feels like it's that way. And I've had people say to me in those times when you were just grinding it out, and wandering in the wilderness is kind of a grinding time. And so a season you're kind of grinding it out. And people would say to me, it won't always feel like this. A better day is coming. And there have been times when in my pastoral ministry, I've tried to share that with other people. It won't always feel like this. I know you're grinding it out right now. It is heavy and sorrowful and mourning and disappointing, but every day is not going to feel like today. And there's going to be a day, a good day, when we hear a good word. And in his own way, God is going to say what he said to those people, long enough. It's been long enough. To say that. We said last week, one of the sad things we hear from God is when God says, too late, at the end of the story, okay, we'll go. And God says, no, it's too late. But one of the best things when we struggled is when we hear God say, it's been long enough. A better day is coming for you. You probably have the answers already in the next few blanks I had about God answers prayers in 3 ways. Yes, no, and wait. And if we are in one of those times when God says, wait, the good news is there will come a time when God will say, that's long enough, and the waiting will be over. So he's telling to them, the waiting's over, but I also want to note as they move forward, and we'll see here, it's not like God just says, so walk right on in. It's all yours. There's no challenges to it. There's no exercise of faith you have to do. It's all smooth sailing. No, there were going to be some challenges that took place. So if I had the idea of waiting for God is until he solves every possible predicament and pickle I might face, that's not what he wants. He tells them to move forward, but there are challenges on the road here as they're going to Moab to be set up for this place to go into the promised land. So, but a great thing when God says, it's long enough. It's long enough, especially when we're struggling through something. The next thing, old covenants are still intact. And these are covenants we're going to talk about that God has made with people groups. And now the Hebrews are encountering them. And even though it has been hundreds and hundreds of years, God is still honoring and recognizing these peoples and protecting them in some way as he does his work with the Hebrews on their way to the promised land. Let's pick up as they go through some occupied territories. Probably weren't a lot of folks sharing land with them in the wilderness, but here they're going through some occupied land. Give the people these orders. You're about to pass through the territory of your relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. They will be afraid of you, but be very careful. Do not provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land, not even enough to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own. You are to pay them in silver for the food you eat and the water you drink. They'd be terrified. Just because you could walk in and stomp them out and defeat them doesn't mean you should. And the reason not is because there's covenant there. So the Edomites were descendants of Esau. He says that there. And who is Esau? Esau was Jacob's brother. Esau and Jacob had lived 600 years before. And so here is God still honoring this favor that he made with Esau and providing that place for him and for his descendants. Now, Jacob and Esau, mostly we know that they feuded a lot. The Bible even says before they were born, they were wrestling in their mother's womb. So they didn't always get along so well. In fact, I put a little note there. Centuries later, Edom was still angry with Israel and rejoiced when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. And that was 1,000 years into the future from this story. So 587 BC, when Jerusalem goes down, and the Edomites are rejoicing. So there's a lot of bad blood that takes place. Boy, bad blood in families can be the most intense, can it not? So while there's that friction there, at least in this story, we see where God is honoring covenants that take place. And so there with the Edomites there, God says, treat them respectfully. You've got silver for food. God has provided. They had the treasures of Egypt that they had left with and still had, and they had some means, so take care of that. Then we come to another part, another people group. The Lord your God has blessed you with all the work of your hands. He's watched over your journey through the vast wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You've not lacked anything. So we went up past our relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. We turned from the Arabah road, which comes up from Eliath and Ezeron Geber, and traveled along the desert road to Moab. And so they don't have a costly confrontation that's going to thin out the number of soldiers and military that they have, and they could trust God. As a reminder there, God has provided for you. You've not lacked anything. You don't have to defeat these people in such a way that you compensate some of the goods and the treasures of their land. Show the respect that God would, and 600 years of a previous covenant he keeps. Then in verse 9, we come to the next part. Then the Lord said to me, do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any part of their land. I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession. And so the Moabites now were to be spared because they were descendants of, and I just read it, descendants of Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham. So Lot's descendants are even more distant relatives than Esau's descendants there in Edom, and yet there is still that respect for them. I gave Lot this promise, and now 600 or even more now years ahead into the future, God is honoring that covenant too. So these first couple of groups that we're referenced to is they passed peacefully through, they were allowed peaceful passage, they're gone through, and that is honoring a covenant that is God's, and God keeps his promises, even though we don't always. And over time, we're less likely to keep our promises, but he is. The next thing, defeat the enemies that come to you, because not all the people were as accommodating to the Hebrews. And it says, from the desert of Kedemoth, I sent messengers to Sihon, king of Heshbon, offering peace and saying, let us pass through your country. We will stay on the main road. We will not turn aside to the right or to the left. Sell us food to eat, water to drink for the price of silver. Only let us pass on foot as the descendants of Esau, who lived in Seir, and the Moabites who live in Ar, did to us until we cross the Jordan into the land the Lord our God is giving us. So it's the same kind of arrangement. Let us make the same deal. And it sounds very like handing out the olive branch. Can we do this peacefully, civilly? But they're not going to have much to do with it. And there's an interesting verse there in verse 30. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, refused to let us pass through. For the Lord your God had made his spirit stubborn and his heart obstinate in order to give him into your hands as he has now done. And the thing that God hardened his heart, back in Exodus, during the plagues of Egypt, the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And sometimes it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And I preached recently about the dangers of having a hard heart and closed-mindedness and always thinking you have all the right answers and all the solid answers. An interesting little dynamic here of how much was God doing the work here, and maybe just some of the personality of King Sihon there to close it up. But the conflict comes to the Hebrews. They pass through two people groups without conflict, but here they have this conflict that has come to them. We don't go looking for a fight, but sometimes, they find us. So the Lord said to me, see, I've begun to deliver Sihon and his country over to you. Now begin to conquer and possess his land. And we'll just keep reading on to verse 32 and following. When Sihon and his army came out to meet us in the battle of Jahaz, the Lord our God delivered him over to us. And I'll pause right there because it gives credit to God, right? The Lord our God delivered him over to us. But the rest of the passage, there's a lot of personal pronouns here about what they did. And I'll emphasize them as I read. The Lord delivered him over to us. We struck him down together with his sons and his whole army. And at that time, we took all his towns and completely destroyed them, men, women, and children. We left no survivors, but the livestock and the plunder from the towns we had captured and carried off for ourselves. So seemingly taking pretty good credit for what God had done. Guilty as charged. We've all done that at different times, but we do kind of see that. Now, one of the questions that comes up in Deuteronomy and also in other parts of the Bible is this one. A question we face in Deuteronomy is the allowance to strike down entire peoples, because it says, they destroyed them. Men, women, and children left no survivors. And you can ask, how could a loving God condone such a thing that would kill off, not just the army, but the women and the children in a culture as well? And I'm going to give you a few thoughts, and I want to begin by saying that all of these are inadequate, but they are some ways by which we can get maybe a handle or two about what is going on in the grander scheme and picture of things. So let me start with this one, and it says, every day of life is more grace than anybody deserves. When you get your first breath, your first heartbeat, your first thought, whatever it may be, that is God's grace at work, and that's more than we deserve. And I know, some people live longer, and some people live easier lives than others, and some people live shorter and people harder lives, and I don't always understand why that takes place and why some struggle and some are more in a charm situation, it would see, a fortunate and blessed place. But every day is a day more than you deserve. And so anybody, who's passed away, seemingly even young, there was God's grace in that they even existed. Second, eliminate the potential spread of wickedness. One of the things that God's people were going to be vulnerable to, and we read about this throughout the rest of the Old Testament, is the pagan religions that were around them. And here were folks who, in their practice and their worship, would offer child sacrifice, which God condemned. There was the practice of temple prostitution as an expression of worship to their pagan gods to hopefully enhance the fertility of the earth and their crops and such. And we find out the Hebrew people kind of vulnerable, could be led astray fairly easily on this. And so like we do sometimes with our small children, we're trying to keep temptation and wickedness and pitfalls as distant as it can. And maybe this is kind of it's better to have a clean slate here in a grander scheme of things. Again, that is at least something that is food for thought. Third is perhaps they put up resistance unto the end. There are some cultures that is dishonorable to surrender, and so you fight till death. And maybe that was part of their culture. I know in World War II, some of the folks who fought on the Pacific theater against the Japanese, that their culture was dishonorable to give up, and so they couldn't. Our Allied troops couldn't fight till the other side surrendered. They had to be totally defeated before the victory could be finally won. So perhaps where was this? Number 4, the destruction took the fight out of everyone else and accelerated the end of future conflicts. And we'll see that these early victories the reputation of the Hebrew people starts going before them and puts some fear and trembling in folks and makes them less eager to fight the Hebrews, puts a little fear in them, makes them a little easier to defeat. It says in verse 25 of that chapter, "This very day I will put the terror and fear of you on all the nations under heaven. They will hear reports of you, will tremble, and will be in anguish because of you." So let's make an example out of the first people who battle us, and then the others will not have so much more fight in them. My understanding about the Civil War is that when General Sherman, bringing his Union armies through Georgia, burning down Atlanta and kind of scorching everything, so destructive, not just winning the battles in the military, but was just kind of taking the heart and the fight out of the Confederacy, by doing that, by such a blanket destructive victory. Perhaps we have similar nuances taking place here. And the last one I'll give you some, again, food for thought on, that God's allowance of where they were in their understanding. It's really not, as we've talked about the difference between God's perfect will and his permissive will. And his perfect will, when he'd be out there wouldn't be war, but his permissive will is sometimes there is some bit of a necessity for that, and that permits some things that in an ideal situation he would not want. Now I'm putting a scripture here for you where Jesus is approached, really to trip him up, about the subject of divorce. And he does a little bit of a comparison between the perfect will of God and the permissive will of God. So Pharisees come to him, that's Jesus, and test him. And they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, he replied. He goes back to the beginning of marriage, Genesis chapter 2, a passage that I read often in any wedding ceremony I officiate. That at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and to be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. And so they go up to Deuteronomy, to something that's in Moses' word. And why did then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Then why is that taking place? And look at the answer that he gives. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. It's like God's put this allowance in there, but it's really not because of you, because your slowness and your hardness of heart, and you're not at a better place of understanding. This allowance was taking place. Now let's try to translate that same thing into here. Maybe here in this day of Deuteronomy, that God is saying, okay, this is where you are, and so this is something that's going to be permissible, but it really isn't in the perfect will of God for there to be peace and peacefulness and peacemaking taking place. We could compare it maybe in a modern day, another comparison to like slavery. Slavery is abhorrent. Slavery is a disgrace. We all would think that today, but until 175 or so years ago, slavery was legal. And it's taken us a while now. And now we know there's pockets of slavery in the world, even today. And we say this is terrible. And there's ministries that our church supports to stop human trafficking and human slavery and prevent that hideous thing from taking place. But for a long time, it took us a while as human beings to come to that place to say, gosh, this is terribly wrong. This is saddens the heart of God. It's not the way he designed some things to go. But for a while, that was permitted to go on. I will note this, that the victory gave the Israelites encouragement and confidence. They had never been a people with their own land. They had never had a military. They'd been slaves in Egypt. They weren't a military fighting people with training in an army that had been going for generations and generations. So it must have been pretty meaningful for them to have victory there. So from Aor on the rim of the Arnon Gorge and from the town of the gorge, even as far as Gilead, not one town was too strong for us. Our Lord, our God, gave us all of them. We say sometimes in sports, a team's on a roll. They're just winning every game and things are clicking and going well and there's confidence and momentum is on their side. You kind of read that in this. So coming back to the point, that there's a battle that they are put in place to have to deal with. They give God credit for taking care of things, so we can't always figure out all the nuances that are going on, and grants them some confidence they head into the promised land. Go on. Next we turn and went along the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, and his whole army marched out to meet us in the battle of Edrei. The Lord said to me, do not be afraid of him. I've delivered him into your hands, along with his whole army and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon. So the Lord our God also gave into our hands Og, the king of Bashan, and all his army. We struck them down, leaving no survivors. At that time we took all their cities. There's not one of the 60 cities that we did not take from them. So the momentum, the enthusiasm going, and this is feeding these people. They're not yet to the promised land. They're just trying to get to the border. But getting across to the border here, some of these victories are going to help them when they are fighting the Canaanites and the Philistines and those that are occupying the land that God is going to give them under Joshua's leadership. C.S. Lewis said, hardship often prepares ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. And so they're going through some challenges here. Again, when God said it's time to go, it wasn't just that you're going to walk right in. They still had some challenges, but for some exceptional things that was in their future. One last bonus lesson here, and I really just couldn't get past chapter 3 without including this one, and I call this when not to pray. Inclination to say it's always time to pray. It's always a good time to pray. And do you know there are places in the Bible that tell us when it's not a good time to pray, when not to pray? And one example of this here is this part of the story. Moses says to them, at that time I pleaded with the Lord, Sovereign Lord, you've begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is in heaven or on earth who can do the deeds and mighty works you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country in Lebanon. God, we've been wandering for 38 years in the wilderness, 40 years since we left Egypt. Finally, get them to that place you've promised for hundreds and hundreds of years. And boy, right when you get on the border, you can say, can't you reconsider? Come on, God, how about changing the rules and letting me go in? But notice he says, and again, interesting Moses' words here, but because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. And perhaps Moses is deflecting a little bit of blame off himself. This is enough, the Lord said. Do not speak to me any more about this matter. You don't have to pray about this anymore. Why? Go up to the top of because God had already given the answer. That's when not to pray. If God's already given you the answer, you don't have to make it a matter of prayer anymore. His answer is there. But he does allow him go to Pisgah, Mount Nebo in other translations, other places in the Bible. Look west, north, south, and east. Look at the land with your own eyes, since you are not going to cross this Jordan. But commission Joshua, encourage him and strengthen him, for he will lead this people across and will cause them to inherit the land that you will see. We can't blame Moses for asking. He's that close, but he gets a pretty shut down answer right there. But you get this almost consolation prize. I'm going to send you up to the mountain and you can look over. And the last 2 times I've been to Israel, I've taken a couple of days side journey over to Jordan, and I've been on top of Mount Nebo. And you can see, you can look westerly and you can see well into what is modern day Israel. You can see Jerusalem way, way, way in the distance, but you can see it on a clear day. And that must have been pretty exciting and inspiring for Moses at that point. Also note that it is a long, steep drive to the top of Mount Nebo. Moses walked it. Maybe he was done by the time that was over. Didn't want to walk back down. I don't know. But there's a little lesson here about if God's given you the answer, you don't have to pray about that anymore. Finally, it's time to look ahead. Moses reminding them of the past, looking back in order to move forward. Here they're on the cusp of a new land. Not a new land, new leadership. Moses is not going to go with them. Joshua is going to be in charge of them, so there's going to be that change too. And just another type of governing that's going to be. They had been slaves and under a foreign government in Egypt. They had been wandering people in tribes and with some structure, but not like you would have if you had boundaries and borders and an organized government of things. And so Moses is going to focus here in the chapters ahead more about this long-term, more stable situation that they and their descendants are going to join into. And so he gives them this word. We'll just turn the page over and the chapter 4, verse 2, and we'll finish on this. Do not add to what I command you. Do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you. It's going to be a new life in a new place, in new leadership, new land, new feeling. And so there's going to be new laws that you're going to need to practice and follow, and stay with them, keep the commands, don't add to them, don't take away from them, and follow them. We'll continue on with their journey with the Hebrew people and Moses' instructions to them in our next lesson, next time in our study of Deuteronomy. I hope you've enjoyed being with me today, and we'll look forward to the next time. God bless.